The Norsemen, or the Vikings, were an intrepid people. They traveled vast distances. They originated in Northern Europe, in what is present-day Scandinavia, and they essentially traveled throughout all of Europe, from Finland, Russia in the north, all the way down to the Middle East, Turkey, Constantinople. In the west, they made it all the way down into Spain and throughout the Mediterranean, and northwest to England, Iceland, Greenland, and all the way across the Atlantic to North America. The North Atlantic Passage is particularly interesting because it is the largest open body of water that the Vikings ever crossed.
So typically the North Atlantic is a very cold place. Lots of ice, very difficult to sail. And for the Vikings, sailing was very important. That's how they got around. That's essentially what made it possible for them to sail, to get to places like Iceland, Greenland, and eventually Vinland in North America.
One of the greatest innovations was the technology that went into their ships. They built very shallow-hulled ships that really only needed a foot or two of water in order to be able to sail.
Instead of fastening timbers to the frame, they were all fastened directly to the keel and to one another. Planks overlap one another in the clinker technique.
It's called a slake style construction, where they'd overlap successive pieces of wood coming up the sides, building out from the center. One way that they used to travel across large bodies of water was by observing the migration of birds. They knew that birds would need land eventually, and so they could watch the migratory patterns in a given direction and begin to know that there was land over there even if they couldn't see it.
Vikings had limited navigational technology, and when possible they remained in sight of land, navigating by sightings of conspicuous headlands.
There was, for obvious reasons, a lot less airborne pollution in the atmosphere, so visibility was a lot greater. They would use both the migration of birds and they would use visibility to a certain extent.
The final navigational aid open to the Vikings was fleas. The Vikings discovered that if fleas are placed in a box, the fleas hop towards the north side of the box. Using fleas in this way, the Vikings were always able to find the northern direction.
Eric the Red was a man who was born in Norway, and then he was banished from Norway, exiled from Norway, and he fled to Iceland, which was another Viking colony at the time. He was then subsequently again exiled from Iceland, and he had very few places to choose from when it came to Viking lands, so he decided to go out west to find lands further west, and he then founded the Greenland colony, which lasted for about 500 years.
Eric the Red is the one who originally named this new land Greenland. He is credited with saying that he thought people were more likely to come if it had an attractive name, in contrast with Iceland, which he said many early settlers had found an unattractive name. Greenland is certainly an attractive name. It is also an accurate name.
A common misconception about Vikings is that they are these big, hulking, bruised, bloodthirsty, angry, warlike people. There are those few who, did have the nasty tempers and who had the books written about them because they were so unusual that give us the stereotype that we have today.
Thor's hammer is something that is arguably the object and the symbol mostly related to Vikings that we know of in modern society. Thor's hammer is actually the hammer of the Norse god of Thor, who was said to be the god of weather and especially the god of lightning, and he manufactured this lightning by using his hammer to bang on the cloud and banged the skies, and therefore the thunder and the lightning came. In Viking days, the hammer of Thor was a symbol of Vikings and a symbol of Norsemen, so they could easily recognize each other in foreign lands, because very many Vikings actually wore Thor's hammer as a symbol and a talisman for protection. The dragon head that you see on men in many movies upon Viking ships were actually very, very rare. The first record that we have of them is on the attack of the Lindisfarne monastery in England in, I believe, 796. Other than that, there are very few records of Viking longboats on an attack that actually have a dragon head.
Just as often as not, they would prefer not to fight rather than to be this sort of berserker that we have an idea of today.
The Viking were considered heathens for their invasions in monasteries, and as a result were portrayed in the worst possible way.
Vikings never had horned helmets. It's a common misconception. The seafaring Vikings, at least, wore leather tunics with an overcoat, sometimes fur, depending on how affluent in society this Viking was.
The Vikings' clothing was all essentially homemade, so it was a lot of homespun wool and leather. They would wear wool leggings, undertunic, usually an overtunic, and some kind of vest.
This was very good protection against the wind and water at sea. Some could argue that this dress is better equipped for seafaring than many of today's various jackets.
The technology that went into Viking clothing allowed them to be very, very comfortable in the cold and in the wet and in these long overseas voyages.
The name Vinland appears on no modern map.
Vinland is still a topic of debate because unlike the Viking lands of Helluland and Markland, there is no pinpointed area of which the description of Vinland is. No one really knows where Vinland is.
There's some debate as to whether it was whether they actually discovered gooseberries or some other form of berry that they mistook for grapes and ended up calling Vinland, even though they had periods of peace with the natives, whom the Norse called Skrælings. Their relations weren't always positive with the Skrælings, though. They did get into conflict with them, and in Leif Erikson's case, it's documented in the Saga of the Greenlanders that his settlement was able to defend itself from these attacks. However, the attacks were becoming more and more frequent, and the sheer numbers of the Skrælings that were warring against the small Viking settlement of maybe 50 to 100 people were just too vast for the Vikings to be able to survive. So the Vikings ended up needing to abandon the settlement and to retreat to Greenland because it became a war of attrition, and they abandoned that settlement and returned home.
Vikings never actually disappeared. The Viking culture that we traditionally know from movies, the Norse culture with the Norse mythology of Thor and Odin, disappeared gradually through the Middle Ages thanks to the introduction to the Vikings of Christianity. The one Viking settlement that we could consider when extinct is the Greenland settlement. The last recorded event, I believe, was in 1490, which was a wedding on the western settlement. However, after that, there is no record of any Viking activity in Greenland, and since then there's been no clue as to where these Vikings went. Vinland exists theoretically in the Icelandic sagas and in the Vinland sagas. No one actually knows where it is. We do know that it exists, and we do know that Vikings traveled there, but where the exact location is still up for debate.
I'm not even sweating that Chicago lost. We got the Packers next week, and we're going to destroy them.
No, Chris, we're talking about the Viking prehistoric, not the NFL players. Do you know anything about the prehistoric Vikings?
Well, no.